name is Tony from Quiltoni and Craft Hackers, and I am the one that creates the Sprite Stitch Child's Play charity quilts every year. I've been asked by many people in how I create the quilts, my process, things like that, so I decided to make this video detailing step by step how the quilts are created. So this year's quilts are from members of Sprite Stitch from around the world that have sent me their quilts, their squares for the quilt throughout the year. Each square is hand cross-stitched by the members. When I receive them, I gather them all up, and then the first step is to wash them. I wash them in cold water only with just a little bit of detergent. After they're washed, I hang them to dry, and then once they're dry, I move on to the second step. So now all of the squares have been washed and ironed. It's time to cut them out. I use the Shape Cut, which is a fantastic cutter. It cuts perfect squares and rectangles, so you just have to line it up. The instructions were for people to stitch an area of 6 inches by 6 inches, and that's what most of them have done. Although it is 100% cotton, so it does stretch and move in the process of stitching, washing, and ironing, which is, as you saw while we ironed, we tried to move it and stretch it into the position as possible. So I want to have at least a 1-inch border all the way around, so I'm going to cut an 8-inch by 8-inch square. So in this case, I'm going to use the 3 and the 9 and the 3 and the 9, and I'm going to try to center this as much as possible. As you see here with the Minecraft square, the lengthwise is perfect, 6 inches. The width, though, is not. We still have a little bit of space on either end. I will try to accommodate that whenever I do the actual assembling and sewing. So for right now, this is as centered as it's going to get. So I'm going to go 1 inch out. So I'm going to go to the 10. And you do have to do it a couple of times because Aida is pretty thick. It's not like regular fabric. And the 2. So that gives me, oops, it likes to move a little sometimes. That gives me a perfect 8-inch. Now whenever I turn it, I'm not going to move my square at all. It's very, very important. But I am going to pull this out a little bit. Just so we have the square here. And now I'm going to turn this so that my lines line up here. And I've got it between the 3 and the 9. So I've got my square again. So now I cut this way. Now this is a rotary cutter, so you notice how I keep my fingers away from the actual blade. I have a friend that cut the tip of her finger off, and I know she's watching this laughing. So you actually want to do it a couple of times, holding the cutter, the guideline down, but keeping your fingers away from the actual rotary cutter. And now we have our square. And I'm going to do this for every single one of these squares, and once I have them all cut out, I'm going to go on to the next step. After I have finished cutting all the squares out, my next step is to create the actual layouts of the quilts. This is the first layout. What I do is I just take, I honestly don't remember who made which squares and how many, but I want to make sure that they get divided up as evenly as possible. So I've taken all of the squares and I have put them into 2 different piles. This is the first pile, and of course this is now the second pile I have in my hands. So all I do is I count them. So in this case, I have 18 squares. I still have to leave space for the Child's Play logo and the Sprite Stitch logo. So I need at least 2 empty places where those are going to go. So in this case, I had 18 squares. It was simple. I could do a 4 by 5, including those 2 squares. I haven't color blocked. I haven't done anything. I just lay it out. So my next step I'm going to do now is I'm going to take a look at the colors in these squares, and I'm going to move them around depending on what I like. So in this case we have lots of greens, and up here we have lots of blues. So I'm just gonna, oh, we've got some greens here, so this is the one that'll be easily moved. And let's just switch it with here. And I don't have lots of greens, I have blues. That looks good. That's darker, and that's, oh, these two are too darker that are next to each other. So let's move that. Now I can't do that. Now I need a lighter square for down here. So let's do that. And I need some brighter colors over here. Maybe if I shift these two, and then, nope, that's good. That's good. Okay, so for me, I think this layout for this one is good enough. And here's the layout for the second quilt. Now I didn't realize it at the time, but apparently I have an even number of squares, 18 and 18, which is perfect. That has never happened. So these are the squares that I've got for the next quilt. So I've just laid it out. I haven't done anything to it. So now I'm going to take a look at the colors in them and maybe the designs, because it looks like these two may have been from the same person, but I'm not sure, just because it has that same kind of feeling. I definitely want to split that out in case that person has another square in the other quilt. If they don't, I'm going to have to flip them, because the next step is I post pictures of both of these on Sprite Stitch, and they're going to let me know if they have all of their squares are in one quilt, which of course I want to split them into two different ones, or if they don't like the arrangement I've done and they think that I should flip a couple of the squares. So that's about a couple of week process taking care of that. So this one I definitely don't want there. Let's switch it with this one. No, I don't like the colors in that. Ooh, that's nice and bright. Yeah, that's much better there. Although I have some dark here. Let's move some of the darkness out over to here. And this one needs to get switched with a lighter color. Maybe here. I like that. Okay, so let me stand here. Definitely. No. If I switch this one down here. I like that better there. Okay, so let me take a look. And okay, so I'm happy with this layout, but again, I'm going to ask the members of Sprite Stitch to give me the opinions. The next step, after we figure out the layout, is they're also going to vote on the color of fabrics. So I picked 3 different ones this year. I picked that one, and that one, and this one. So I will take a picture of this showing these 3 different fabrics, and they will vote to let me know which one they want me to choose for the fabrics for this. So I try to pick bright, nice, brilliant fabrics, but at the same time a little bit neutral so they can go with almost anything. So that's why and of course there's no designs on the fabric, which is very important because you want the square itself to be the centerpiece, to pop out and be more important than anything else. After I finish making my squares, the next step is to start assembling the quilt. Now, this is still a day before they've actually finalized the layout, but I can go ahead and start adding on my borders for my actual cross-stitch pieces. I don't have to have the final layout before I can get started on this step. So while my embroidery machine is busy making those final squares, I'm going to start adding on the borders. So I did put a 1 inch border all the way around, even though we need about a 1/4 inch for the seam. So what I've actually laid out is this is all of the color that they have decided. So the voting ended yesterday and it was a tie, so I flipped a coin and this is the color that the coin landed on. So this is the color of all of my borders and sashing. So what I'm going to do is lay my piece out like here and pin it on. And I have a little bit here. I'm going to have at least of a 1/4 inch, probably about a 1/2 inch that I'm going to have because I want to have a little bit more of a seam than I normally have because I want to make sure this is extra stable because it is a different type of material than I normally work with. So you have to make sure it's super, super stable. So I make sure I have about a 1/2 inch seam between the edge of here and here. And I'll show you why we're doing it like this in my next step. Now that I have put all the squares onto the sashing that I'm going to be using, now it's time to sew it. So I'm using a neutral colored thread, so it's an off-white. I always find that's the best thread for me to use, that you don't see it if you happen to see the thread through it. And I'm going to actually follow right along and sew right along the pattern. So in order to do this, I have to go pretty slow and actually, let me try to line it up right here. And I'm just going to follow right along and try to go as straight as possible so that when I iron it, I iron the fabric away from the square. There we are. And I'm going to do this all the way down because I've attached the squares on the fabric all the way down the strip. And I do this for every single bit of my squares. And I'm going to do it on the bottom, on the top, and then on the sides. Once I finish sewing, the next step, of course, is the ironing. And I mentioned before that I'm going to sew strips all the way around. Now, I'm not being too careful with my cutting, and I'm not going to trim them because I'm going to use my squaring template and get perfect squares when I'm completely finished, and I will show you that process. So whenever I am ironing them, I'm ironing away from the square because this Aida is a much more tougher material than this Stonehenge cotton. So I always sew away, I always iron away, and it gives it a much nicer, even seam. And by sewing right along that square, you don't get any of the background Aida. So if you notice the first year square, you can see little bits of white along. It's because I didn't use this process. I didn't frame them before I sashed them. So it's a little bit different process that I'm using that has evolved through the years. Now that my squares have all of the borders on them, it's time to center them and trim them. So I'm using my perfect square and rectangle cutter again. I absolutely love this thing. And I've decided after measuring all my pieces that I want to do a 9-inch square. So I'm going to go 9 inches around. So I'm going to take my 1 and my 10, my 1 and my 10, and I'm going to center them as much as I possibly can because this is fabric and this is cross stitch. So you see there's going to be a little bit of wonkiness. But it looks like that right there, actually here, is probably the best centering I'm going to get. So I go with the 1 and the 10. So there's my 10, there's my 1, and again, I'm not moving my square. I am removing the fabric I've cut, and I'm lining up my 1 and my 10 along there. Now I'm going to look at my 1 and my 10 here in order to line it up. If you notice here, I'm looking at my 2.5 and my 8.5, and I'm seeing how far away from the center they are. And that is actually how I'm centering it. And I then cut my 10 and my 1. And I have my square. And here's my nice square that is ready for the quilt. Now, I'm going to do the same thing as you see for my embroidery squares. So my embroidery squares, I've already done the same thing. I've got my borders on, and so I just line them up. Now the embroidery squares are a little bit bigger than the others, which is one of the reasons why I chose a 9-inch square. But I want to keep this the same, because my sashing that's going to connect all my squares together has to have an equal square. So the squares have to be the same exact size for my sashing to line up. So I'm going to do this for every single square for both of my quilts. And then it's the next step of laying it out. I finished putting the borders on all of the squares, and as you can see, each of the squares is the exact same size now, so it's easy for me to add the sashing. So I need to make sure that the order I've got my squares in doesn't change, because this is the layout that we all agreed on and approved on through the Sprite Stitch forums. So what I'm doing right now is I'm actually adding on little sticky notes that tell me which row and which column each of these squares belong in. And what this does is it keeps it straight throughout the entire time while I'm adding on that sashing, so that none of the squares get mixed up and in the wrong order. And I will do this for both of the quilts, and I will make sure that they all stay in the order that we agreed upon in the forums. The next part, after I have all of my little name tags on there for the rows and the columns, is the sashing. Now the sashing is what connects all of these blocks together. So I've decided to use black again this year because I like how the black makes everything pop. It gives the brighter colors even more brightness to them. So for the first row, this is row A, I'm only adding the sashing to the right hand side, because on the left I'm going to add my outer border. So I don't have to worry about the left hand side of all of these. So for A1 I've added it to the right. For A2 I've added it to the right. Now I don't add it to the left because right here A1 is going to be on the left. So A2 I've added it to the right. A3, now A4, remember, is the outside again. So I don't have to worry about adding it to the right on this one because the left, it's already there. So I'm just going to take this and I'm going to completely set it aside away over here from everything else. So the 4s I don't have to worry about. So the 1, B1, I've added it. So B2, this is where I've stopped, it's time to add it. So all I do is I lay it on my fabric that I've already cut out, my strips, and I pin it in place. And I'm going to sew a 1/4 inch seam all the way down for each of these squares. And this is what I'm going to do for those squares. So B2 now has a portion onto the right. And I'm going to do this for every single bit of my squares. Once I have sewn each of these parts, I'm now going to sew them together in order to get an entire strip. So my point is to get an entire strip together, and then I can add the tops and the bottoms. And now I finished adding all of the center sections. So I have an entire strip. So this is my A strip. So it's now time for me to add the lengthwise sections. So I'm only going to add to the bottom of each one. So in this case, it's A, so I'm adding it to the bottom. Now if you've noticed, I actually measured everything out ahead of time to make sure that these squares were perfectly aligned for a single strip of fabric across. So I didn't have to add any fabric to either side. So it's just a single solid sheet all the way across. And I'm going to do this for all of my strips except for row E, because row E is going to have the outer one on it, so it doesn't need a strip for me doing this. And once I finish sewing on all of these strips, the next step is then for me to add the same exact size along the outer edge. And the lengthwise, or the up and down, the vertical border of this black, I will have to sew two pieces together so it can have the entire black surrounding it. So there is my strip, and I'm going to do that for, like I said, for each of these. So for each of these strips, so for row B, C, and D, I'm going to add one to the bottom. And then I'm going to sew them all together and then add the black all the way around from the same exact size to keep it, to make it so it's symmetric all the way around. So all of the sashing is done, and I'm now putting on the outer borders. I decided to make the sashing 3 inches, so I cut a 3.5 inch strip. So whenever you do borders, you have to, if you do more than one border, or if you do a sashing and border, you have to make sure the math equals each other. So I could do, you know, 1 times this, 2 times this, divided. It just has to make sense. So because this is a 3-inch border overall, I've decided to do a 1.5 inch border for the actual outer border. So I've cut my strip 2 inches so I can account for the 1/4 inch seam. So I just need to get them added on. After I add on my outer border, I will then measure my finished quilt and cut the batting and cut the backing. I will have to cut the backing into 2 pieces and assemble it together because the quilt is more than 42 inches wide at this point. So I will have to have at least 2 pieces making up my backing. So once I have that, the next step is going to be laying it all out and pinning. I don't have a long arm machine, so when I sandwich my quilt together, I actually have to do it the old-fashioned pinning way, which is what I'm doing now. Whenever I have a quilt that is a just general lap size quilt, it's small enough for me to do it in my own house. But if it's anything larger than a regular lap size quilt, I have to come to my friend's house, which is where I am right now. And the first step for the pinning that I always do is to tape the backing to the ground. So whenever I tape it, I use a super wide masking tape. So it's a painter's tape. And I make sure when I tape it to the ground, I make it tight enough so as you see, as I start to pull it tight, all of those wrinkles go away. Even though I ironed it whenever I first assembled it, you can't really tell because it's been folded and put into my bag. That's not a problem. You can have some wrinkles. A lot of that's going to fall out in the washing, as long as you originally iron it whenever you put it together. Now when I laid this out, you'll notice this is my seam right here. So the seam is facing up because you're sandwiching it together in 3 pieces. One of my first quilts that I made, was a Steelers quilt. And my family's big Steelers fans. I'm not a big football person, but my family is. And my father-in-law is also a big Steelers person. So I thought, oh, well, you know what? I make some Steelers quilts. So I put this quilt together. I sandwiched it. I quilted it. I bound it. And I looked at it and I said, something's wrong. But when I initially laid down my backing, my seam was the wrong way. My seam was facing down. Of course, this is one of the first quilts I ever made. Well, I still gave it to my father-in-law for Christmas, and he loved it. I don't know if he realizes that I did it wrong, but I did. And because at that point, you don't want to completely undo the entire quilt. So now my entire backing is finished. I'm going to walk around, I'm going to make sure that all my tape is flat against the ground. And then I'm going to lay out my batting. So this is the centerpiece. All of my batting is an 80-20 cotton poly blend. Well, what that means is that 80% of this batting is cotton. 20% of this batting is polyester. I like it better than the 100% cotton battings because the 100% cotton battings tend to be a little stifling. They keep you warm in the winter, which is fantastic and wonderful. But the cotton poly blend actually does a little bit better for my taste that I like. It actually helps regulate your body temperature, keeps you warm in the winter, but it also keeps you cool in the summer. So I use my quilt that I have for myself in the summertime as well. So as you notice what I'm doing when I lay this out, I am smoothing it as I go. And I'm making sure it's nice and smooth. And you know what? I believe, nope, I laid it wrong. I cut this so I could, there we are, because it's longer than what it needs to be. So I'm going to try to center this the best I can. Because when I assembled my backing, it's not this long, as you'll see the next step. So I'm smoothing this out. There we go. And I smooth, get all the wrinkles out. So, as I was saying, I cut this batting to give me 2 equally nice pieces, and I thought it was this way. There we are. Oops, still have a little bit over here. Smooth it all the way out. Fantastic. Okay, once my batting's all smooth, now it is time to add the quilt. And as I've said before, I'm very lucky this year. It's the first year it's happened that both quilts are the exact same size. So it actually makes it easier for me when I'm cutting backing, binding, when I'm doing anything, because I measure one of them and multiply it by 2. Alright, so my goal here is to get it centered so that I can smooth it both to the right and to the left. There we are, so I'm going to smooth out. And as I smooth, I make sure there's no wrinkles in there. Some people like to start from the top. I start from the bottom. But if you notice, when you smooth, you always start from the center because you're smoothing it up and out. Now, in quilts, you're going to get little pieces like this where the thread is kind of hanging out. That's perfectly fine. You just yank those. So if you ever get a quilt and you see those little threads coming out, it's just the threads from the fabric. You can pull them. It's not a problem. And I'm just double checking to make sure my fabric here is good. It is. And there is my smooth quilt. So my next step is to pin it. So I have my pins. And now these are special quilting pins. For those of you that do not quilt, these pins have a curve right here. So the curve actually helps you dig down into the quilt. And I don't scratch the ground, I don't scratch the floor, and it helps get all 3 layers. It's a specialty kind of pin. After I finish pinning this whole thing, I'll cut around it, and then it's time for quilting. After the sandwich is made, the next step is the actual quilting, like I said. Quilting refers to the actual sewing together of the layers. So you have your top layer, so you have your quilt that you've created, the actual layer. You have your backing, which you saw me tape down the back, and then of course you have the batting that I already talked about. I've already gone through and stitched along the outside of the quilt. I have a problem with the first couple of years I was quilting. I realized that I would have a problem if I'd get so involved in the quilting itself, I wouldn't pay attention to the back, and the back would actually sometimes fold in and get caught in all my stitches, and then I had to redo the whole thing. I had to go through and undo all the stitches and completely fix it again. So because of the style and the way that I quilt, it doesn't get any puckering out here, so I've learned that if I actually put a basting stitch along the outside, it holds it down in place and it gives me some practice, so I don't have to worry about that back. Now I have to use these gloves. These are special quilting gloves, and they have a special padding on the tips that allow me, because if I touch the fabric now, it's going to slip and slide. When I put these gloves on, well, now it's not slipping and sliding so much. As you see, it actually grabs onto the fabric and gives me a much tighter grip. As you see, I need new gloves, which I'm hopefully going to get in the next couple months. So I've got my my feeders down. I'm going to do what's called a meandering stitch. So basically I'm just going to do whatever I feel like. I'm not going to do any type of pattern, design. If you look at any of my quilts, I almost always do a meandering stitch. Very rarely do I do anything else, because for me, that's what I like to do. I like to wander and aim along the quilt. So I make sure I don't sew these pins at all. And I've gotten myself out of the corner. Now I've already checked my tension. So you see here how it's the same on the bottom as it is the top for the stitch. I've already gone through and figured out the tension on my machine for this particular quilt. Sometimes the tension does change, so you may have to adjust that for each quilt. And this is what I'm going to do for the entire quilt, for both this one and the second one. Now you notice that I came close, but I haven't actually quilted where the cross stitch part is. That is because this is a very tightly compact area where people have stitched. Normally when you do your quilting, you want to never leave a space more than your fist. So you always want to make sure you quilt within that for stability. This is one of the exceptions, because I have a specialty tightly stitched area. I'm afraid if I quilt over it, number one, will pull the thread. Number two, it may ruin that design. So I've learned that even under heavy washing, it's through trial and error that I learned, I can go without stitching this area. Now normally you don't want to do that, but in this case for the cross stitch quilts you can. So after I stitch the entire quilt, then I'm going to trim it along the edges here. So I'll cut along the edges and make sure it's perfectly squared and it's nice. And then comes the binding. Binding is a three-step process. The first step is to actually sew the binding onto the quilt. Some people like to purchase the binding. You can actually buy it from Joann's and other fabric stores or quilt shops. I like to make my own binding. So this is binding I've made myself. So step one, I'm going to add it on. I'm going to sew it on. I'm going to leave a little bit here so that whenever it comes back around I can tuck it under so it seems seamless. And I'm using a 1/4 inch seam. And I'm just adding it on just like this. The very first project I did was a couple of placemats. They're really nice placemats, and I really enjoyed them, and it's how I learned how to quilt, but I put the binding on backwards. So this raw edge was actually up here, because I didn't understand how to add it on at the time. Step 2 of binding, once you have it completely sewn on, is to pin it. So I've got the quilt flipped over onto the wrong side, and I'm just pulling it gently, folding it over, and then pinning it in place. So making sure that it's completely smooth all the way down. I'm not pulling too hard, because if I pull too hard, then this is going to start to fold over into the quilt. So I'm doing it, just pulling it gently. And again, all of these stray threads doesn't make a difference. They will all come out eventually in washing or in wear. Sometimes you'll see me at conventions picking all those threads out as I'm standing there talking to people. It's just one of my habits that I tend to do. So I'm going to do this all the way around the quilt until all the binding is pinned on. And then the last step of the binding is to sew it into place. So I have it pinned completely all the way around. So when I sew, I'm just going to follow right along the edge right here. This is what's called stitch in the ditch, because I have a ditch here and you're not going to be able to see my thread unless you really look closely at it, because it's the same color as the binding. And it's just going to go right here all the way through. And I'm going to do that all the way around for both quilts. And that is the last step of the quilt. And there we have our finished products. This is the first quilt, quilt number 1. And here's quilt number 2. Now you notice in most of my pictures there is the living room of my friend's house. Unfortunately, it's a bit too bright today, so I've had to use their kitchen. But you still get a nice view of how these finished quilts show how they turned out. And that is how I create the quilts. So both of the quilts this year were posted up on Sprite Stitch, and there was a vote to decide which one was going to be sent to the Penny Arcade dinner auction. The first quilt won, so I am actually mailing that off tomorrow. So the Penny Arcade dinner auction, which is held in Seattle, will see that very first quilt. The second quilt will be auctioned off by me somehow, and of course all proceeds will still go to Child's Play. The members of Sprite Stitch will decide if I'm going to just do a complete online auction or if I'm going to do an online silent auction slash live in-person auction at a convention. I'm leaning towards that second one. I think that's what they're going to choose because that's what they chose last year, and it was really successful. If you have any questions at all about my process, about Child's Play, about cross-stitching, Sprite Stitch, anything at all, please feel free to contact me, and I'd be more than happy to answer any questions. Have a fantastic day, and happy crafting!